This is Bill Levinson with Levinson Productivity Systems. I'd like to thank you for buying LMS 2012, a framework for continuous improvement. The PowerPoint presentation, and actually if you're listening to the audio version, there's a set of 4 presentations. We'll go into the details of LMS 2012, what it's about, and what it does for an organization and for a supply chain. Okay, why was LMS 2012 created? There is a clear, and this will be shown from the history of the Ford Motor Company and also some more recent experiences, but as of yet unmet need for a structure or framework for lean management systems, namely a structure or framework that will ensure continuity of the system despite loss of key personnel, for example, and also deployment throughout the supply chain as opposed to isolated islands of excellence, as they're called. And it deploys what Henry Ford called a universal code that includes technological and human relations aspects as an unofficial standard. The first thing to do is take a look at the effectiveness of lean manufacturing in the language of money, which is the language that we have to speak if we want upper management to buy into or support any kind of program. The Ford Motor Company achieved a 100-fold productivity improvement. This was reported in 1915 in the book called Ford Methods and the Ford Shops. There was a very rapid increase in wages along with lower prices for customers simultaneously. For example, in 1922 they had a wage of $5 a day, which was actually quite a bit. Back then a loaf of bread might cost a nickel or a dime, and I think a week's rent was something like $10 or so. $5 a day was a lot of money back in that era. Also, when Henry Ford bought out his stockholders in 1919, that was 16 years after the stock was issued, he did so for $150 per dollar invested. Ford's own book, My Life and Work, says $15,000 per $100 par value, although his production chief, Charles Sorensen, reports that some stockholders held out for as much as $2,500 for every dollar invested. So that's pretty impressive bottom line results. What was Henry Ford's universal code? Basically, it's the foundation of the Toyota production system. Taiichi Ohno wrote openly that he learned almost everything from the Ford Motor Company and some of Henry Ford's books. So Ford's universal code is the foundation of the Toyota production system just to begin with, and in a little more detail, it's a systematic synergy of the lean and the technical aspects of lean. Systematic means it's deployed throughout the organization and the supply chain as opposed to isolated activities or so-called islands of excellence, and synergy is the other important aspect of Ford's universal code. Synergy means that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In order to make lean work on a very wide scale, you have to have both the technological aspects, things like Kaizen blitzes and some analytical techniques that you'll learn in this slideshow, but also the engagement and buy-in of the entire workforce. That's where you get into behavioral science, and Ford stressed its importance in no uncertain terms. That's where you get workforce-initiated or workforce-supported application of the lean enterprise technology. We're going to look at that in a little detail later on. Just to say up front, there's a book by Norwood written in 1931 about the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant, and Norwood used the phrase, "it worried the men," and on more than one occasion when it came to any kind of visible waste or muta in the workplace, and this led to employee-initiated action to remove that waste, increase the company's profitability. The goal of LMS 2012 is therefore to systemize, standardize, and deploy Henry Ford's universal code, and of course everything that's developed since then, including some powerful analytical techniques and other new methods, as an unofficial standard to ensure continuity of the program. In other words, it'll survive changeovers in key personnel, and also implement it on a system-wide basis as opposed to isolated pockets of excellence. Those are the two key points to keep in mind. Now we're going to look at the key learning objectives for this slideshow, the summary of takeaways that the viewer or listener should get from this set of presentations. Okay, first of all, why does the manufacturing community need a lean management system standard, whether official or unofficial? Noting that there are all these standards around. We have, of course, ISO 9001, 2008 for quality management systems, or the automotive ISO TS 16949, ISO 14000 environmental, ISO 50001 for energy management. Now they've come up with a new standard for Six Sigma. So why do we need a new standard? Well, part of the answer is that LMS 2012 uses a quality management system as a foundation. You have to have a quality management system before you can do a successful lean program. And also it in turn supports ISO 14001 and ISO 50001. The reason being is if you address your material waste issues and your energy waste issues, you're dealing with the key aspects of ISO 14001 and ISO 50001. Also recognize that the standard is the servant and not the master, and this is going to carry over into the quality system standards as well. A lot of companies regard them as costly annoyances, something they have to do to get the certificate. Well, it might be important to get the certificate, but how the standard is approached determines whether it's a costly annoyance or a valuable servant that makes the organization run better. The next step is to understand the difference between critical to lean, and we'll abbreviate that as CTL, and critical to quality characteristics. Now, everyone knows what critical to quality characteristics are. They're the features of the product that have to be within specification to meet the customer's requirements. However, the key point is that critical to lean addresses whether the product will be expensive or inexpensive. You can have high quality product, but it can be costly or inexpensive depending on whether it's lean. And waste, unlike quality problems, is asymptomatic. That's a good word to remember. It means there aren't any symptoms. If you have a quality problem, it'll make itself known as scrap, rework, or even worse, a customer return, and then you have to go through a corrective action process. If you have a lot of waste in the operation, though, you can be meeting the customer's requirements for quality, but at far greater cost to the customer and yourself than necessary. To support this objective, we're going to present 4 lean key performance indicators, easily memorized by the entire workforce, comprehensive. They cover almost any conceivable form of waste. As a matter of fact, they cover the Toyota Production System 7 wastes, and also the metrics of the Goldratt theory of constraints, and those will drive continuous improvement. The next step is to understand a proactive improvement cycle called IMAIS, stands for Isolate, Measure, Assess, Improve, and Standardize. What it means is you isolate a process, and that's following the SIPOC model, Supplier Input Process Output Customer model, for analytical purposes, and measure everything that flows across the boundary of that process, namely time, materials, and energy. And by measuring what goes in versus what comes out, and what comes out is either product or waste, that's going to identify the waste or the muta, and then you go through traditional closed-loop corrective action processes to remove that waste, implement your improvement, and finally standardize the improvement. Unlike corrective action requests and most other problem-solving cycles, IMAIS actually sets out to look for trouble as opposed to waiting for trouble to be brought to its attention. This is consistent with the fact that a lot of waste simply hides in plain view or becomes built into the job is taken for granted and people don't notice it. This forces it to become visible. And the last learning objective is an overview of LMS 2012. It's organized to be similar to ISO 9001-2008. That's to allow for internal auditing purposes piggybacking onto ISO 9001-2008. And remember, it does assume that the company has implemented some sort of quality management system, whether registered to the standard or not. It assumes that the system is there, and also, of course, what LMS 2012 does. Okay, first learning objective, why LMS 2012? Why do we need another standard, whether official or unofficial? Okay, first observation, a first-class lean manufacturing operation is a system as opposed to a set of tools. And lack of comprehensive systems is why lean programs do not deliver world-class results. The book goes into some more detail. There was a survey of some companies that had implemented various lean programs, and only about a third or so of the companies that implemented the programs reported extremely good, or at least good results from them, and the result appears to be lack of a comprehensive system. The same observation has been made with regard to Six Sigma. You can have a lot of black belts and green belts and some demonstration programs, but in the absence of a system, you're not going to get world-class results for that, and as a result, ISO has in fact seen the need to come up with an official standard for the DMAIC process. Now we'll look at an excellent example here. Basically, the company that developed Lean into a comprehensive world-class system and program actually forgot their own achievements and had to go back to learn them from the Japanese. The Ford Motor Company developed Lean on a widespread scale, including things like just-in-time manufacturing, design for manufacturing, even attempting to achieve zero-emission manufacturing. But by the early 1940s or so, all that was collapsing. They were basically forgetting their own methods, and the reason appears to be that Henry Ford himself was incapacitated. He had some strokes starting in the late 1930s. He really wasn't the person he was, and he was no longer able to run the company except as a figurehead. His son, Edsel Ford, who actually was a very capable manager despite what the company later named for him, died relatively young. He was only 49 or 50. And Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, who seems to have been at the center of everything the company did, retired. So when they lost their key personnel, they basically lost their Lean program, and by the 1980s or 1990s, they were visiting Japan to learn about all these marvelous Japanese quality and productivity methods, and the Japanese told them, well, these are your own company's programs and ideas, and the people from Ford didn't even recognize them at that point. The lesson here is that you can have the best Lean program and even Lean culture on earth, but it can't survive the loss of key personnel unless you have some kind of standard, whether official or unofficial, to keep the program going regardless of personnel turnover. The first step is to consider the concept of systems as opposed to tools. The term island of excellence means when someone brings in a new method, maybe design of experiments or Kaizen Blitz or Six Sigma, and applies it to an individual process or individual activity, you improve that process or activity, but the rest of the organization can't keep up with it, so it really doesn't have as much importance as it should, and what you get is commonly known as an island of excellence, maybe island of excellence in the sea of mediocrity, as opposed to system-wide performance. That's why we have things like ISO 9001, ISO TS 16949, and it's important to note that back in 2000, ISO 9000 went deliberately to a process focus, that is focusing on processes as opposed to individual activities. So it's taking a process perspective, and ISO recently introduced a standard for Six Sigma. They saw a need to systemize Six Sigma. This is a very useful and applicable quote from a presentation given in an Industry Week webinar by Brent Tadson. The title was Planning and Executing a Sustainable Lean Transformation. Cites a glass ceiling between mere use of tools and techniques and the continuous improvement culture. Now note the point about the culture, assuring that the company is on top today will be there 20 years from now. But as shown by the Ford Motor Company, they did have a lean culture, and when they lost some key personnel, they lost their lean system, their lean culture. So it looks like you need even more than the culture. You need a standard to ensure continuity. The lesson of all this is that we have to systemize lean. We have quality management system standards to standardize the quality program. We're now introducing a lean management system that ensures the continuity of the lean manufacturing or lean enterprise program. Okay, so the need to systemize lean indicates the need to standardize lean. It's always important to bear in mind, though, that the standard is the servant, a means to an end, and not the master. In other words, not an end in itself. And this concept, by the way, is very helpful. The next part of the slideshow is going to be very helpful if you're trying to get your workforce and or your management team to buy into something like ISO 9001, your quality management system standard, or any other thing you're trying to standardize.